Yeah, you have probably already noticed that my English is not really well done for this kind of jobs, or my skills have been. And anyway, instead of trying to make a synthesis, I'd rather briefly summarize three of these excellent papers and ask one or two concrete questions just to introduce the general discussion. And I hope that as many people as possible can raise hand and ask their questions or give commentaries. Theoretically, we have time up until 5:30. I wouldn't think that we can continue to the end, but anyway, we are entitled to it. So first of all, my thanks to Allan Antliff for his very comprehensive overview of Kumaraswamy's career in the British and American intellectual history, and especially the connection or the relationship or the distance, I would say, with Clive Bell and Roger Fry was a very good illustration. And also I could say that the World of Whitman was so popular at that period, and most of the intellectuals in the world very eagerly read it. And it has something to do with the American spiritualism and transcendentalism and so on and so forth. And we really have to grasp that human relationships of many thinkers in a larger context and constellations. And also interesting is that the fact that Clive Bell tried to make a connection between the so-called traditional art with a case of Van Gogh or Paul Gauguin, and these two so-called modernists began the appreciation of these painters came in England quite late, as you know, and Roger Fry was one of the initiators, and he was also writing on the controversy between George Birdwood and the reinterpretation, for example, of the Indian Buddhist history. So maybe my question or my commentary will be that something as book like Clive Bell's art, which quite freely making connection between the Indian or Oriental art to the contemporary art. And that kind of, I would say, non-chronicle approach is, in recent years, not really allowed among the specialists, especially because of the specialization of the discipline of art history and art curating, and how this kind of human heritage and cultural heritage can be combined once again so as to nourish our knowledge and our wisdom. This is rather a very conventional remark, but I think as we are gathering here to think about Anand Kumaraswamy, these kind of possibilities, which is already out of date, must be reconsidered. This is my commentary on the first speaker. And second, Kim Croswell located very clearly the position of Stella Bloch and as dancer, and the influence Kumaraswamy exercised on her, to which extent it was fundamental for her career, was clearly mentioned and clearly analyzed. And my very brief question would be, it was during their intimate relationship that Kumaraswamy, for example, wrote a paper on the Indian womanhood, status of the Indian woman. And I wonder if that statement would be relevant in the so-called feminist studies, women's studies, and the gender factor is also involved, and the third world and first, anyway, the West and the West relationship is also implicated. And how do you evaluate that kind of paper, and especially is there any special intention by the side of Kumaraswamy of addressing it to a certain female figure like Stella Bloch, or is that paper intended to a larger audience? And what would be the reception of that kind of paper in a contemporary context and in our, today's context of the cultural studies? And finally, my thanks also to Mark Sedgwick, who very clearly located, once again, Kumaraswamy's later works, no longer in a strict discipline of the description of the art history of India or in the East, but rather in his speculative aspect, which was already very present from his youth, but which had a very concrete expressions in his final years, especially in his close relationship with René Guénon. And of course, René Guénon was not successful as an academic, but still he had and he still have a very strong influence. And especially his basic position was, rehabilitate the Mediterranean tradition in one sense or another, saying that Christianism in France has some close relationship with Maghreb countries and Islam, for example. And this stance was, I would say, exaggerated in 1930s, especially because of the establishment of the Dutch regime in Germany. So even in Western scholarship, I think there is a kind of antagonism between the German-speaking countries and French-speaking countries, and the reaction that, for example, Burkhardt showed a kind of hostility towards Kumaraswamy seems to me have not something to do with that, general tendency. And I would say, I would add that Hinduism and Buddhism is even nowadays very well received and well and easily available in French translation. And as far as I know, the French translation gives a very clear notion of what Kumaraswamy is. And in my impression, I do have the impression that in France, Kumaraswamy is regarded as more important in that aspect rather than as art historian. Maybe I'm wrong, but I expect some estimation and variation on that aspect. And The Time and Eternity is also, in my sense, is a kind of masterpiece. And how is it evaluated is also one of my interests. And the final question probably, which is relevant for all of us here, is the fact that Kumaraswamy in his last moment wanted to return to India. And what was his intention? Is it more or less closely related with his stance as traditionalist, or is there any speculation possible? This will be also my remark. And to conclude my improvisation, I would say that the intellectual constellation in the 20s and 30s and 40s is very an important task for the intellectual history in general. And the criteria of the East and the West and force was no longer relevant at that period. And each of the person has received many impact from other thinkers. And I quoted this morning from the Phala Sutra, the metaphor of one jewel is reflecting every light from the other jewels, and one jewel's light is reflecting all others. And Kumaraswamy was one of that kind of jewels, which reflecting everything while his reflection in mind is spreading all over the world. And the individualistic, I would say, approach cannot really grasp that kind of cacophony, which was the reality of that period already. So to think about Kumaraswamy requires us development of a new kind of methodology in the study of intellectual history, and probably you can give some good ideas or inventive, proposals in that direction. I'm looking forward to your reply. So I finish with this. Thanks very much. So maybe, if you don't mind, could you kindly give your reply or something?
That's a daunting question. Claude Bell's art is a model for approaching understanding across cultures. Well, obviously, I share Kumaraswamy's perspective in terms of its inadequacies. I don't have a faith in a synthetic, unitary vision of understanding. Rather, I approach understanding in terms of a process of learning, which is ongoing and which is dialogic. And so that's my response to that particular question that you posed to me.
Thank you for your question. It's one that has been on my mind as well. First of all, I'd like to say that my approach to Kumaraswamy from the beginning has been one of a feminist intervention. I really strongly believe in the personal as political, and so I looked into his personal life to see how his politics played out. And in The Dance of Shiva, Kumaraswamy writes about the status of Indian women, and he also writes an essay called Sahaja. Now, this is not the first time he writes about women. He wrote on women in 1910, when he was married to his first wife, Ethel Partridge, and it was an essay called A View of Oriental Women. And he found his views on women directly from his interactions with Sister Nivedita, who wrote The Web of Indian Life. So everything that Kumaraswamy thinks about as far as traditional roles of women are concerned, especially in India, he's getting it secondhand from Nivedita. I haven't compared the two essays. So in a span of 7-8 years, he writes again on the status of Indian women, and it goes much more in depth. I haven't compared those two essays, but I can say that at that time, his biographer, Roger Lipsey, talks about that essay being related to his relationship with Ratan Devi, the musician, and then takes another look at his essay called Sahaja and associates that essay with his relationship to Stella Bloch. And those are two interesting essays to compare and contrast these contradictory understanding of what womanhood was all about. Whereas with his relationship with Ratan Devi, she was a mother, she had 2 children with him, and he was concerned about his relationship with her. He talked about his dissolution as tragic. So when he was writing about marriage and relationships, he had her in mind. But when he's writing about Sahaja, which is an aesthetic, idealized, spiritual love, he has Stella Bloch in mind. And in that essay, he talks about how not every woman is made out to become a mother. So he has some very interesting non-normal gender roles that he's willing to play with to say that not every woman is going to be a mother or wants to be a mother. And in those instances, those women do other things with their lives, as Stella Bloch did.
Thank you. I think what you say about the difference between the German-speaking and the French-speaking worlds is important. It's complicated slightly by the fact that Burkhardt and Sean were both Swiss, where of course the French and the German-speaking worlds come together. But thank you. There's also a distinction with the English-speaking world, of course, as well. The question of the intended return to India is a very interesting one. And there are two clear possibilities. One of them is that, yes, this is Kumaraswamy adopting personal practice in the ways that other traditionalists did. So this is his alternative to becoming a Sufi. The other is that it's part of the Kumaraswamy myth, because after his death, the traditionalists build a certain myth around him, and his son Rama joins the group that Chur is leading, and Lipsiv publishes his first article on Kumaraswamy in a traditionalist, an English language traditionalist journal and so forth. So the traditionalists are building a myth, a certain myth around him. So there is also a possibility that this intended return to India is the traditionalist response to the apparent problem from their perspective that he isn't adopting a personal spiritual religious practice of the sort that they would approve.
Yeah, thanks very much. Yeah, I'd like to open the discussion to the floor, and who want to intervene? Yeah, according to the number of the hand raised, I have to calculate yeah, please go ahead.
We've had a very interesting discussion all along. I have a question and a couple of observations. One of the observations is with regards to the dance aspect. Martha Graham in 21 performed Flute of Krishna, which she in later years regretted tremendously due to the issue of a kind of cultural appropriation or inappropriate use of a tradition in that at that time period. Second thing is, listening to all that Kumaraswamy was able to do you think he would have advocated for change of timelines to reflect the unique historical cycles of Asia and Europe, which are not very different but also do not overlap in contemporary times if we do the readings of his. And Mark, I had some ideas about what you were saying. Why traditionalist is anti-modern? That was a question that I was curious to know. Why would you use those terms? And what is a failed academic?
Just to respond to your comment, Martha Graham actually studied dance with Ruth St. Denis, and that's where she received her training, so she clearly absorbed the initial training with that. And I'd also like to say Stella Block, at one point in around 1927 in New York, was more famous than Martha Graham. But the reason why her fame sort of was eclipsed was that in the late 20s, dance was becoming codified as American, and Martha Graham assumed the mantle of American, and being someone who dances more non-Western style, then that kind of slipped by her, so that's how that part of her career ended.
Okay, so your question was about temporality in relation to notions of history. And does this relate to the idea of the post-industrial? Yeah. because I think of Kumaraswamy as engaged, coming out of this context of the arts and crafts, and not just the arts and crafts, but the radical arts and crafts movement, which he's intimately involved in. He's propagating a politics, I suppose, of hope in terms of that as a possible route or alternative modernity. And that certainly breaks with the narrative of the backward as opposed to, the advanced and all that. So it's a dramatic shifting of that perspective, which was so pervasive in the Western imperial discourse about other cultures and so forth. So in that sense, Kumaraswamy certainly is reconfiguring a perspective. The question remains: does he on that basis cast the West into a past or a narrative of the past, or he does have a narrative of degenerating culture, cultural context and social context, economic and political, in relation to the industrial, capitalist, imperialist monoliths that are running all over the world. He doesn't see them, as models for the future. Just the opposite. He's also concerned about the impact of those systems in non-Western contexts, obviously, and first and foremost in India, too. So I suppose to not use the temporal model, but rather the degenerating model, he would see signs of acute erosion of all the values and the socioeconomic way of life that makes those values possible, that he embraces and wants to further, not only in India and other parts of Asia, colonized contexts, but also in the epicenter of the industrial capitalist project. So I move away from a temporal model more towards this critical model in relation to the state of the environment, the state of people's lives, and so forth.
I'm sorry, I didn't entirely. The question was, why is traditionalist, and I didn't hear the rest of it.
Why is traditionalist? Why do you consider traditionalist anti-modern?
Because they do. I mean, it's not, this particular movement has a very clear view of modernity, which they write about at great length. And they understand modernity as the inversion of everything, the loss of contact with the sacred, the final age, decay, degeneration, foolishness, ugliness, every possible negative thing is clearly associated with modernity, because modernity is understood as the contrary of tradition. So that's their understanding of it, not mine. I'm okay with modernity.
Actually, I was wondering about that too in relation to fascist politics, because fascism definitely projects an image of fascist modernity.
The connection between Evola specifically and fascism is a complicated one. Evola never joined the fascist party because he thought that it wasn't sufficiently right-wing. And in later life he said that whilst many people said that fascism had ruined Italy, he himself thought that Italy had ruined fascism. So his finally in the later years of his life, in the 1960s and 1970s, when he has become, this is long after Kumaraswamy's death, obviously, but once he has become one of the leading theorists of the new right, the question of how you combine political action with a conviction that modernity is inevitably leading to collapse is a rather complicated one that he solves by developing what is in a sense a variety of existentialism, that although it is pointless, it is still good to fight.
So maybe another question or in continuation with the discussion, as you like? Yes.
I just wanted to sort of ask the panel something that Inaga-san just ended with. It was a question I think that got missed along the way in terms of the methodology of approaching Kumaraswamy. I'm wondering whether you all had any thoughts on this.
Okay, I'll be on. For me, it was through personal letters. He wrote to Stella Block many, many letters. And so I was learning about her through his voice, which is a very strange, backwards way to do it. But her letters are destroyed, they're missing, so I only had one side of the conversation. And so I was reconstructing what I could tell from their relationship and then augmenting that with the books he was writing and the things that he was training her up in. So for me, it starts from the personal and then expands into the ideas that he's working with. And then out of that, I started to look at well, what does this mean in the larger picture? So after that, I decided to expand and try to understand the Orientalism debate as it relates to Kumaraswamy and try to nuance that. So it's, again, from the very personal outward to the theoretical.
My first encounter with Kumaraswamy was through my research. Related to my first book, Anarchist Modernism, which looks at the intersections of various anarchisms in the United States during the period of World War I, prior to and into 1920 or so. And I was impressed by Kumaraswamy's agility, political and otherwise. In terms of arriving in the United States as in effect, someone who's been banished from the British Empire and persecuted with his property seized and so forth, and maintaining his radicality in that context. I was very impressed by his bravery and determination in that context. Also, the way in which he was entering into a dialogue with other radicals and shaping their views. Particularly surprised to realize how he impacts on the arts. Someone like Rockwell Kent, but there are others. John Mowbray Clark is another person. Alfred Stieglitz is another person who was mentioned earlier. And the discourse around modern art, he contributes to a whole bunch of discussions around modern art. Finally, in my own life as an activist, working in particular with Indigenous peoples in my region of Canada to fight against things like pipelines, the destruction of the environment, and so forth, and my own political awareness of the crisis that we're in, I was amazed to encounter someone coining the term post-industrialism and thinking respectfully of other ways of being that don't have to do with that level of exploitation that we brought to bear on the planet, and that relates to my anarchism.
I think there are two questions. One of them is the standard one gets with intellectual history of any sort, that one's got the influences in and the influences out. What impacts the person we're interested in, and what impact does that person have on other people, which then can usefully and much more difficultly be put into the general question of the context of the period of the 1920s, 1930s, and what's going on in that period. I think another thing here is the question that was actually raised before in the morning session, where somebody asked, well, where can we place Coomaraswamy other than in the Romanticism and nationalism? And I think that there are two places where one can place him beyond that, in two much larger streams. And one of them is the perennialist stream, which, as I say, has been going on since the Renaissance, and is an answer to two very, very fundamental questions that human civilizations face. One of them is, what on earth do we do about the problem of the multiplicity of religions? And the other one is, what do we do about the issue of the authority of revelation? In what ways do we find a particular revelation to be authoritative or not? And those are two fundamental questions which are behind the perennialist approach. So that's one way in which Coomaraswamy fits into a very old and very long and very important discussion. Also, the whole question of anti-modernism is a question that is not as old at all as the question about the multiplicity of religions or the authority of revelation. But it is a question which certainly goes back to the Enlightenment or the French Revolution, and the whole issue of what is happening. Is progress happening? Is progress something we can expect to happen? Is progress really good, or is progress deceptive? So this is a whole series of questions which I've occupied people before, become, I think, especially important in human history after the French Revolution. And this is another question, another long tradition, in a different sense of the word, into which we can place Coomaraswamy, as well as the other clearly very important questions of Romanticism in the village and so forth, and nationalism.
You know, I've been thinking about that in terms of the fact that he complicates modernity, he complicates the idea of the modern. He has his own alternative conception to what's, dominant, and so like the anti-modern doesn't quite do it for me in terms of characterizing his approach to modernity. But I recognize, the period you've studied, it's very, very clear in terms of that particular stream of traditionalism, which I'm grateful for you introducing me to. It's fascinating.
Yeah, thanks very much. Is there any other commentary or question? Please go ahead.
It's an open question to the panel. What just was mentioned by Mark Sedgwick as his agility. So that agility I also see in how he translates cultural concepts like samvega into aesthetic shock, or say like rasa into permanent emotions, which is not entirely correct, because rasa, like sthai bhava is permanent emotions, rasa is something else. And so he does this very agile translations which has currency in like two very different intellectual circuits, right? So I don't think it's very simplistic to just call him Orientalist and just leave it at that, but it needs like a more nuanced reading, how he translates concepts, cultural concepts which are very complex, and yet he successfully fits into two different intellectual worlds. So I just wanted your comments on that.
Thank you. Like you said, there's elements of all these theories that emerge through how he's expressing his ideas, and of course he has the overarching sort of generalizations sometimes that the Orientalists have, but he's also opposing the dominant culture, which is the Western side. So of course that comes out to reverse Orientalism. So to bring it out into the more porous model is actually to describe the porous model, I should say, it's a good analogy for it is the analogy of the cell membrane. And so if we consider the so-called Western civilization and Eastern civilizations as two cells with a membrane that the influences can come between the two cell membranes, but each membrane remains intact and whole. And this comes up to the issue of hybridization. He vehemently opposed hybridization because in the situation of Indian culture having to survive the onslaught of colonialism, the dominant culture, by creating a hybrid with the dominant culture, erases the colonized culture. So that's why he opposed it, and that's why there's a bit of a debate about that as well. Did you have anything? Okay, did you have anything? Yeah.
I think this whole question, the translational cultural context, is another one of these incredibly fundamental issues that affects humanity. And I think it's something on which there's a sort of pendulum swing. Because at one extreme, as soon as you try to do translation of cultural concepts and say this is the same as this, or this translates into this, you get accused of, as Coomaraswamy was accused by some of his reviewers in his later period, of what we would today call essentialism, because any attempt at translation involves something which is going to look pretty close, because you have to essentialize the concept before you can translate it, right? And also attempts at translation, such as Coomaraswamy's, open themselves to charges of ahistoricism, of ignoring historical development and historical context and so forth and so on. And at present, it seems to me that the pendulum is swung in that direction, and people are very careful not to be essentialist and so forth. But sometimes the pendulum swings in the opposite direction, because many people do find a need to translate cultural concepts, partly because it also provides one particular variety of solution to the problem of human difference, because it reduces human difference, actual human difference. Apparent human difference, yes, but we can translate it, and then actual human difference is reduced. And the great name here is a sort of associate member of the group who I was talking about, the great historian of religions, Shigemi Inaga, with his concept of the archetype, which he derives partly from this group and uses to precisely to perform this translation of cultural concepts. And Eliade was extremely popular in, what, 60s, 70s, I think? And since then has sort of slipped off the academic reading lists into the general interest section of bookshops, which is something that sometimes happens, that various procedures and concepts which are rejected by paid-up academics are still found quite interesting by members of the general public, which is where Eliade finds. So, yeah.
Yeah, thank you very much. Yeah, the time closing is approaching. If there is any, the last question. All right. Yeah, thanks very much for your cooperation, and I don't really like the word collaboration because it's individualistic idea. And we finally came to the problem translation, which is quite important. And I did fear the danger of speaking of Kumaraswamy only in English. That's partly because of my handicapped English. But he was such a polyglot, and his capacity of capable of treating many languages must be taken into account. And as we have already checked, several terms like in Bengali or Sinhala cannot be easily translated into English, and Kumaraswamy had to struggle with that. But his output in English was so fluent, and we have the illusion that it's so easy and so natural, but there is a danger in that. And we can also Mircea Eliade and the East Asian, East-Western, East European intellectuals' heritage and their vagabondage must be also taken into account. And there is a kind of typology. There are many, ladies coming from East Europe, got married or had a relations with the so-called Eastern sage or Eastern genius, and they create something very interesting. And it happens quite often in the margin of the colonial situation. And this geographical and I would say geological situation must be also taken into account. And last but not least, we talked about John Cage, and Kumaraswamy gave a drastic inference on that. And John Cage was also quite interested in an Zen Buddhist D.T. Suzuki, as you know, everybody. And the person that I mentioned today, Yanagi, was also very closely related with D.T. Suzuki. When Suzuki returned from the United States, Yanagi was the first student in learning English. And also for Okakura Tenshin in the Book of Tea, there is a quote from the Tao Te Ching. This is the translation made by Suzuki when he was still very young. So there's that kind of concentration which connects everybody, and we really want to try to develop that like a web. Okay? So we still have so many things to do, but probably for this afternoon is the time to close.